Find that.
Here.
From the state. This is what you have to go by.
You just need to.
Yeah. But yeah, qualified.
You just need to do that.
Yeah, certainly. So it's like, yeah, you're like, don't kill the messenger.
It's here. So you need to do slideshow.
Okay, so we're ready. Okay.
Yeah, qualified.
You just need to do that.
Yeah, certainly. So it's like.
Oh, it's a delay.
Slideshow.
Ready.
This sound.
No, just this sound. Yeah, qualified. You just need to do. Yeah, certainly. So it's like.
Oh, it's a delay. But if we don't have this,
Well, there you go. Now make sure mine's on. Okay.
is it gonna pick up our voices? You said it should. Okay.
Do I need to, we all need to be on the camera or do you?
Do we really need to be on camera? I need to see my pretty.
Be able to hear you.
Yes.
Video.
For us.
Parking.
Oh, all right, guys, we'll just go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming to our Parent Academy. Today, we're going to talk about multi-tiered systems of support in special education. Our presenters today will be
Robin Brodsky, school psychologist.
And I am Timmy Hunt, the MTSS coordinator and 504 contact.
And I'm Katie Keeper, the special education lead teacher.
And through this time, we're going to review and discuss MTSS, the referral process, evaluation procedures, eligibility, 504 versus IEP, and any questions that you all may have. So to start out, this is one of the most comprehensive visuals that you will see that describes MTSS as a whole. So this pyramid describes all of our students. All of our students are part of the MTSS process, and at the base, as you see, every student receives Tier 1 every day, high quality instruction, differentiated instruction at the Tier 1 level. What you notice is when a student is not responding to Tier 1 instruction, we move them up a tier. If they are not responding at the Tier 2 level, they move up the tier. And as you see, that's just where that goes. And just if you notice this, and I know this was a conversation piece, but all students, regardless of where they fall, whether they're gifted students, but these are existing students. To move up the tier, you may qualify moving forward, and that's what Katie and Robin is going to talk about later. But all of our students at the school, whether they're gifted ELO students, students with disabilities, current or existing, they all receive Tier 1 instruction, okay? So to qualify or how we identify students who need additional supports because they're not responding at the tier 1 level, we look at the risk levels. So the universal screener that we use is the MAP, and you guys shared that was what you all received a comprehensive understanding about. So we look at those percentage levels. And if you see not at risk, if a student is performing at the 30th percentile or above, we still consider them a tier 1 student. In that high quality differentiated instruction, the small groups, the centers that teachers have in classrooms will substantially continuously support those students. Even if a student is performing below the 30th, within that 20 percentile to 30th percentile range, we still consider them a tier 1 student. And we just want to emphasize in the classroom that they're being pulled in those ability groups and teachers are supporting them with the differentiated instruction, okay? So students who have elevated risk, those are the students who perform within the 10 to 20th percentile. Those are the students that teachers will be recommending for tier 2 instruction, okay? And those who perform between the 0 and 10th percentile, those are students that, like our high-risk students, that we want to address quickly. And this is what that looks like. Again, okay, yes, Robin, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I just want you to be aware that this is what the bell-shaped curve is. And I know it sounds kind of weird, but students in this green range, this is the 25th percentile. This is the 75th percentile. So I'm giving you a quick review of statistics. So this is still considered average. And I know parents get a little, upset when they say that their student is performing at the 25th percentile, and we're saying that that's still average. But just understand that as the continuum goes on, the range gets smaller, but still, just keep on understanding that 25th to 75th percentile is still considered to be within the average.
Okay. So again, looking at tier 1, all students are receiving tier 1 instruction every day. Differentiated instruction. And again, the universal screener is what we will utilize to identify students who need to move through the tiers. So if a student is moving to tier 2, remember they're still receiving tier 1 instruction, but they're going to receive some specialized interventions for a skill that has been identified that needs to bridge some gaps. And it's typically some small groups. They get 20 to 30-minute sessions several times a week. Again, it is skill-based, and we progress monitor those particular interventions to see how well the student is responding. And again, in addition to tier 1 instruction. Again, this is a fluid tier process. So if a student is responding to those interventions, they certainly can move back down to tier 1. The teacher can continue to monitor the student at tier 1. If the student is not responding to those interventions, we want to move them up to tier 3, where they will receive more specialized or more specific formalized interventions. Smaller groups is typically 1 to 3 students, but most often it will be one-on-one so that the student can get that specialized time with the teacher. Also, the interval time is increased. So tier 2, it's about 20 to 30 minutes. Tier 3, it's 30 minutes to 45 minutes. More time, more intervals. We are also progress monitoring those interventions. If a student responds to those, which we want, that's great. They can move back down to tier 2. And if they have high response, you can move them back to tier 1, obviously with the conversation, and monitor them just so that you don't put the student off of these intensive supports and then they flounder and then you're starting the process all over again. So we're also always mindful of those things. But if they are not responding to those interventions, this is where we go to the next segment, which Katie's going to talk about.
So if students don't make progress in tier 2 or 3, the team will recommend a referral for special education testing. The team will meet up together, and the team members will include the MTSS coordinator, the special education lead teacher, the school psychologist, general education teacher, parents, and if there are language concerns, the speech and language pathologist. The team will discuss the data collected through the tier 2 and tier 3 process, as well as the interventions, MAP data, milestones data, if that's applicable, and then we'll also discuss parental and teacher concerns. Following the meeting, the team will decide if they want to move forward with an evaluation or if they want to continue monitoring in the tiered platform. So after the meeting, if the team moves forward, I will issue a consent. So once the consent is signed, that starts our 60-day timeline. Just so you know, the timeline doesn't include breaks that are a week or longer. So that stops the timeline and it restarts. At the time of signing, I'll be able to give you a deadline for when we will have to hold the meeting by for the 60 days. During the window, the general education teachers are conducting the interventions and taking the data. So we want at least one data probe per week. And then at that time, the school psychologist and the speech and language pathologist are also conducting their steps. Prior to that 60-day timeline, we'll meet for what's called an eligibility meeting, and we'll decide if the student meets eligibility criteria for a disability. Parents sometimes ask if I provide my own private psychological, will that speed the process up? Unfortunately not. We are happy to use the psychological that you provide. However, Ms. Brodsky, our school psychologist, might determine that we have to do additional testing. But we also need to make sure that we are making data-informed decisions and that there is an impact of the student's disability on their academic performance. So we need to make sure that we're collecting a progress monitoring piece.
One more thing I forgot to add is that the private psychological evaluation has to be current within 1 year. Oh, my turn. Okay. So evaluation process. So once a child has signed consent for evaluation, it's my job to figure out what child's needs are. They are in the testing is individualized. It's not totally a one blanket thing that every child gets because each child is different. Sometimes we discuss some of these things at what we call the referral meeting, where we're referring the child for an evaluation. Sometimes it happens that things were not really discussed, but once I get in there and start testing a student, other things come up and I will test in other areas. So a lot of times I always do a cognitive assessment, which is an IQ test. I always do an academic achievement assessment, regardless of the reason for referral. And sometimes I'll do a more extensive processing test. We feel the student has a learning disability. We need to figure out, how the child learns best, and that's with processing tests. And sometimes we do a behavioral assessments, and behavioral assessments range from ADHD-like behaviors to more severe emotional behavioral concerns. So depending upon what the concerns are, will depend on the homework that both parents and teachers have as far as filling out rating scales. And then there's a lot more observations involved, et cetera, for me in different environments in the school. So sometimes we look at a student that, and say, I didn't realize that that their IQ was very, very low. Doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And and the state requires us to provide more specific areas to assess. For example, their adaptive behaviors comes into play. So I didn't know that going in, that the child was low, but once I get in there and figure that out, I have to further assess in that area. So that's why that there's some leeway there. One more thing that we want to discuss is there's a difference between a diagnosis and eligibility. Diagnosis comes from clinical psychologists in the private sector, and we test here in the schools to determine if a child is eligible for special education services based on state criteria and guidelines, and they're very specific. That's why I printed those things out for you, so you have an idea of what we're talking about. Under SLD, one of the big concerns, and I know Katie will discuss it further, is that 12 weeks of data. That's the real important thing when we're looking at, especially when we're looking at a learning disability. So even though parents come in here with really extensive and expensive private psychologicals that diagnose them with all kinds of things, that does not necessarily mean that they meet state criteria for eligibility under special education.
All right, so after the 60-day timeline, we'll meet up for what's called an eligibility meeting. So the first thing that we do in an eligibility meeting, we'll discuss developmental history, and then we will talk about progress monitoring data. So in order for students to qualify for special education, we must show on our progress monitoring data that the student is not making adequate progress. So we'll review the interventions that were conducted during the 60-day timeline and determine if students made progress. From there, Ms. Brodsky will discuss the results of her testing, and students must meet eligibility criteria under the state guidelines. So students might have a diagnosis like dyslexia or ADHD or autism, but they still might not meet eligibility criteria for an IEP. So they need to meet eligibility criteria, and then there also needs to be an impact on their education that limits their progress in the general education setting. And this is specific for specific learning disability. The state regulations state that we have to have 12 weeks of data. So if parents request an evaluation, that gives us about 8 weeks. So we'll want to make sure that prior to meeting up to sign consent, we have at least 4 weeks of data. So if students are eligible, they're found eligible for an IEP, then within 30 days, the team will meet and they will talk about the child's initial IEP. So the parts of an IEP include present level strengths and weaknesses, goals, accommodations, and services. So there is a plan that is similar to an IEP in that it's a legally binding document, but it only covers accommodations. So if a student doesn't need services or goals, but they just need accommodations in order to make progress, they could qualify for a 504. So it's possible to qualify for a 504, but not an IEP. And Ms. Hunt's going to talk about the 504 process.
And so if a student is being looked at to acquire a 504, this is the definition of a 504. It is a physical or mental impairment determined after an evaluation that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And so we have record of such an impairment. Okay, so that's first, we have to have it clearly defined, and then we look at who qualifies. So any child that has a disability that interferes with that child's ability to learn in a general education classroom, the disability can include any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. As similarly, like simply because a child has this impairment, as it states, a child does not have to be failing to qualify for 504, okay? So the disability just has to have an impact on their education. And I think this is helpful for parents sometimes, because you may think like it has to be something severe, but it doesn't. So the purpose of this, and I'm so glad that Katie and I were able to hopefully kind of differentiate the two, but we have this visual that the district provides that kind of delineates the difference between an IEP and a 504 for your review. We don't have to go through this, but we want to provide that for you for your future use. And that concludes our presentation. So if you have any questions that would be pertinent to the group, feel free.
So if you have questions about your specific child, please feel free to reach out to any of us to answer them. If you have questions just about the process as a whole, we're happy to answer those.
It's on the specific team for like giving interventions. Is it just
So if the students are below the 30th percentile, they could qualify for EIP. And so our EIP teacher in K1 is Miss Brooke Mitchell. And then our EIP teacher for 2nd through 5th is Michelle Cab. And then if they are not below that cut score, the teachers will provide interventions.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have lots of questions. I'm trying to figure out where to
Yeah,
start.
of course.
Go for it. I have one child that's here that has an IEP and supports, like that you all know. And then I have another one who had an early intervention through APS in preschool, who's at another school right now, but we're considering moving to Jackson next year. So trying to figure out how that would work. Because the IEP, obviously, it's probably expired at this point, but coming into Jackson, what, how do they roll back into the public school?
Yeah.
Like that?
So they'll have what's called a move-in IEP. It's a little bit tricky because, as you said, the data's old. And so probably we will meet and we'll hopefully talk with their current teachers about their current academic performance and come up with a plan. It's just we might have to amend based on the data. So we collect the data and we're like, hey, this child is actually meeting all of these goals. We'll, limit.
It depends on how old the evaluation is or the initial eligibility was. If it's within 3 years, then we can immediately at least accept it and kind of like what Kate said, have him move in, and then we may need to reassess. But at least they would get the support. But if it's really old, like it was when they were 2 years old and they're now 7 years old, we would have to meet and figure that out. Yeah.
It's also possible to request testing as a private school student. So if your student's eligibility is not within the last 3 years, you can say, hey team, I would like to request an updated evaluation.
DSC or
So if the child is under 5 years in age, it'll be through Office of Early Learning. If the child is older than 5, that would be good verification.
Because we did a kindergarten transition meeting and had everything set up and then decided to go another route, but and he'll be going into 2nd grade, so it's right up 2 years.
We still may be able to use the information, the eligibility report, and like Kate said, just get them in,
Yeah.
and then we would still probably reevaluate.
I know goals and things like that would
Yeah,
have to be
yeah.
adjusted.
But at that point, I think an evaluation would be yeah. But we still may be able to use that eligibility report if it's less than 3 years.
Okay.
And it's still, even though he's left and came back, it would still be considered current.
Okay. Is it the eligibility report or is it
The
last time?
I think it's the eligibility report. When he was last time eligible, you're considered eligible for 3 years. So,
Okay.
so it would still be considered current, even though we would still like to reevaluate.
So I looked it up over the time that so we can talk about it. If we want to do it. So, sure.
Any other question?
I know there's something also too, if the first, or their eligibility versus their declared SDG, then is it age 9 that you have to?
On it. Oh, yes, that is true. They're not all SDGs. The majority of those little babies that were have eligibility at age 3, 4 years old do have an SDG, significant developmental delay, as their eligibility. That can no longer be considered appropriate by age 9. They can't be. They have to have either caught up. They're not delayed anymore, or they have to have another area for us to consider it. So, so yeah, so they have to have the law says before they're 9, we have to, or privately, they have to be reevaluated.
Okay. More questions, Erin? Anyone? More questions?
Sure.
Okay, well, we are here, so if you need to ask the questions after the presentation, that's fine.